This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to Emory Cardiovascular Grand Rounds. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Dick Kovacs, who's our guest coming from Indiana University School of Medicine today. A brief intro, Dr. Kovacs got his MD from the University of Cincinnati School of Medicine, did all of his training, including cardiovascular fellowship at Indiana University School of Medicine. He was chief resident and fellow there. It'd take me too long to go through everything he's done. His current title, he's a Q.E. Sally Russell Professor of Cardiology at the Krannert Institute of Cardiology at Indiana University Medical Center. Many of you know he's the past president of the American College of Cardiology, and currently he's the chief medical advisor and CMO for ACC as well. Personally, I got to know him as he's also one of the founding members of the Sports and Exercise Cardiology Council for ACC. But this morning, he's going to talk about one of his other passions, of course, Drug and Device Safety 2022. Dr. Kovacs.
Thanks, Jonathan, and glad to be here and interact with those here and those online. Certainly coming to one of the premier influencers in cardiovascular care in the United States has been on my bucket list for a long time. So I appreciate the invitation, especially and appreciate Jonathan's hosting this, and decided, since you have also one of the premier sports cardiology programs, that I didn't want to bring the proverbial coals to Newcastle, but talk about something else that you don't get exposed to every day. So I want to talk about drug and device safety. These are my disclosures. You'll see it's fairly heavy on things. Safety monitoring boards, clinical events committee will touch a little bit on opportunities for people who want to advance their careers in this field, which I think is wide open and underappreciated. But in the era of science and controversies and who believes what, I wanted, especially for the younger people, to give you three quotes that have guided me a little bit. This one, I was an undergrad at University of Chicago. You can't read that inscription chiseled above the door to Harper Library, but it's from Francis Bacon, that says to not read to contradict or to believe, but to consider that. And the graybeards will recognize this guy. He was on the evening news when the evening news was trusted, and Eric Severide said that anybody who doesn't read 2 newspapers a day is a fool. Now, I realize that a newspaper is a foreign concept to most online. But then I've been in Indiana long enough. I picked up some of their sayings, and Rex Early, a erstwhile politician there, said that it's a mighty thin pancake that doesn't have 2 sides. So consider what I'm saying, but put it in your perspective. I hope that when we're done, everyone will be able to report an adverse event to the regulatory agencies. And I often poll the room and find out that very few ever have. But also realize that safety surveillance systems in the United States are very complicated and very fragile, and frontline clinicians really have a role in all this. And I want to introduce you to the concept of regulatory science. That may be a foreign concept to many. Maybe people have not heard that word before, but I think that it's really coming into fruition in terms of how we reduce adverse events. Because as we all know, that safety is key to all of our therapies, and an unsafe situation can negate so much of what we've done to bring good care to our patients. So being grand rounds, I was hoping to pick on an interventional fellow, but you're an interventional fellow in the peripheral vascular lab, and you're working away and doing an atherectomy, and oh, by the way, the tip of the device comes off. And what do? Fellows in training. So you can throw it on the floor and move on. You can tell the salesperson, who often is hovering around some of these laboratories, you can pass it off and tell the cath lab staff to deal with it. Or obviously the correct answer is D. You save all the pertinent information and you file a MedWatch report at your leisure. And this isn't a fake case. This is a thing I think called the Hawk 1, which was recalled this year for just such a device failure. Here's MedWatch form if you've never seen one. It hasn't changed in 20 years, but it's a multi-part form. It can be done online, obviously. It can be done on paper. But it gets all the pertinent information extensively, and frontline clinicians have this information. And really, when you talk to regulatory agencies, the biggest problem with spontaneous reporting of adverse events for drug or devices is really they didn't get enough information from the frontline clinicians. So there's my objective one. Hopefully you'll recognize that this is our responsibility when we see unexpected events with drugs or devices. But you're a cardiologist, why do you care? Cardiologists have led this field. There are a lot of recalls of devices, and there's research opportunities in this field. And I want to show a few pictures. Hopefully everybody recognizes this guy. He's on his second term as the FDA commissioner, Rob Califf from Duke. Most will probably recognize Steve Nissen. He brings strong feelings as an advocate for drug safety. And probably nobody will recognize this guy. His name's Lou Cantalina, and I'll tell you a little bit about him later. But we've led in this field of drug and device safety. And Ray Woosley, who's an electrophysiologist out in Arizona, published this paper a few years ago talking about the evolution, and way down in that right lower corner is this notion of regulatory science. And that is the application of scientific principles to the regulation of drugs and devices to bring it up to a higher level. Not just that we're watching, not just that we're reacting, not that we're just making sure that our drug supply is clean and safe, but really applying principles of science. And we've had a great example of this in cardiology. So we all know the multiple pillars of heart failure now, and the success of SGLT2 inhibitors and the ubiquitous use of those in heart failure now, but very few recognize where this came from. And that's where Steve Nissen comes in. So don't see many two-author New England Journal of Medicine papers anymore, but this is 2007, and Steve pointed out in a meta-analysis the cardiovascular risk of rosiglitazone. All the p-values aren't important, but convinced the medical community that some of these diabetes drugs were unsafe from a cardiovascular standpoint. Now, this remains controversial, but it led to this document, which I doubt that many have read, but is the cornerstone of where the SGLT2s, GLPs, and all of the other anti-diabetic CV outcomes come from, because under the guise of regulatory science, the FDA mandated 5-year outcome studies for every new diabetes drug. So the surrogate endpoint of just simply lowering glucose to treat diabetes was no longer the standard, but you had to prove that you were not only effective, but safe. And it led to these kinds of meta-analyses where Emperor reduced, and you can pick a whole bunch of studies that have shown and published forest plots like this, where we see a consistent benefit for these agents in the care of our diabetes patients with heart disease, with heart failure, with and without reduced ejection fraction, and have revolutionized the care. All of this coming with its roots in safety. So I'd pay close attention to this. And there is a field here, and an evolving field ripe for the picking for young people. Devices follow a little bit of a different path. Remember, devices can be approved in a much different pathway. A predicate device, something that looks like what you're testing, can be the basis for your approval. We know from our interventional cardiology studies that learning curves are important with new devices. And we also know that long-term safety monitoring, especially for implanted devices that are permanently in the body, are challenging to continue to detect rare events. And here's some of the differences between drug trials and device trials. And I'd just point out, I guess if my pointer actually appears. So, the high importance of physician technique in device trials, the much smaller populations that are using, the difficulty in blinding treatments, hard to blind whether you've gotten a stent graft or not, and much less use of randomization. So they're much more challenging to look at on the safety side, but certainly a cornerstone in regulatory science is independent adjudication of placement of devices, of their continued performance over time, and trying to reduce that operator bias that, of course, the procedure was a success because I said it was. Now, if I have any gray-bearded electrophysiologists, some will remember Telectronics at that time, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, I think the second biggest pacemaker manufacturer in the United States, and they made this great device called the AccuFix J lead, which kept a J in the right atrial lead by means of this thing that's hanging off here after explant, which is a piece of spring steel. Devices fail, and they're in permanently or semi-permanently. And a weld poorly done, breaking and releasing a 5 centimeter piece of spring steel inside your right atrium is definitely not a good thing. But to keep pace and keep the eye on these things in a long term is a big challenge, and was the subject of really this. What I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is this system of safety, which is again about a decade old, from the FDA, trying to leverage this great thing called the electronic health record to continue to watch for safety signals from devices, this elaborate circle of things. So it's not just the passive surveillance, not just the you reporting the individual device malfunction that occurs in your laboratory, but a much more systematic approach, taking advantage of things like unique device identifiers that can be tracked through the electronic medical record, but are not. Lots of national and international registries, and modernizing this entire system to keep our patients safe. And the key things that I wanted to touch on is the unique device identifier. They all have unique device identifiers, but are we following these? Use of our national and international registries, really applying scientific principles to the adverse event reporting system. And I give the example of I rent a car at the airport, and I'm pulling back into the rental car lot, and an employee with a handheld device, and that employee may or may not have a high school education, can come and identify my vehicle, tell me all about it, tell me where I've been, so on and so forth. And then think of the person who comes into an emergency room with an implantable electronic device that's gone off 4 times that night, and the difficulties that we have nationwide with handling that simple amount of information that seems like it ought to be a lot easier to do. So I wanted to walk you through one model system, and these slides are courtesy of Fred Resnick in Massachusetts, and Fred is really an advocate for automated surveillance for devices. He points out that, as we all know, that adverse event reporting doesn't really occur. We don't know denominators. Reports are difficult, but we still need to keep doing it. But can we build on that? Can we do more in the way of active surveillance? And this is done through things like the CDRH, which is the branch of the FDA that deals with devices. Industry keeps their own databases of safety. Universities will keep their own databases of safety. And we try to make these as good as we can, but can we make them better? So Fred has advocated for symptoms of automated surveillance, where by using things like real-time evidence generation, like monitoring all of the databases that we have to deal with, that we can move from these sort of retrospective studies that I call gotcha, you find the defect, to where we're in real time monitoring the performance of the devices and accruing data and moving to where this is happening in our systems real time. And I'll show you an experimental example that they did in this project called Delta, looking at two famous ICD leads, the Quattro, the Fidelis, we know, which was recalled, and looking at these kinds of analysis and looking at scientifically where these event curves start to separate and the difference to where the voluntary recall occurs and the potential savings, not only in time, but potentially lives when there's a defect. And I would submit to you, for those interested in this, the American College of Cardiology, through its National Cardiovascular Data Registries, has an ideal platform for these and an expanding platform for these kinds of surveillance techniques. We have inpatient and outpatient registries, we have PCI and electrical devices, and now especially the transcatheter valve therapy devices registry, which are multiple society registries and have already been proven to be able to do this. This is the earliest demonstration of this. This was just a demonstration project between NCDR and the FDA with closure devices. This is a decade ago, but still important to recognize that the signals, the safety signals, in this case of the VasoSeal device, which was removed from the market, are clear when one have aggregated data, reliable data in registries that we already participate in and contribute data to. So these systems are there. I don't think we're leveraging them enough. And so just to give another pitch for the registries, these circles are where registries can impact. We can actually run clinical trials through registries. We can survey through registries. We can test hypotheses through registries. And so I would hope that people would be inspired to utilize these more. And if you're a policy wonk, there's even food for thought for policy, for health policy wonks. And that is, the TVT registry is a great experiment. Surgical Society, Cardiology Society coming together, putting together a registry on a very new technology. But this whole notion of the central bullet point, coverage with evidence determination. We think this is good. We're going to roll this out nationally. We're going to have a national coverage determination of that, but we're going to continue to monitor this and we're going to continue to develop evidence through the registry as we see this roll out nationally. What is safe? What is effective? What is the right circumstance in which to be applying this therapy? What are the right medical centers to be using this technology? What's the learning curve? So we can continue to develop evidence, and that in turn, for the policy wonks, is what determines the reimbursement. And Jonathan was asking me when I walked in, I had the privilege to testify on behalf of the college in front of the Congress for this probably obscure act of Congress, but the Medical Device User Fee Act, which is renewed every 5 years and supports the development of regulatory science, and actually is the way that sponsors, both on the drug and device side, with PDUFA and MDUFA, fund the reviews at the FDA. But the new act, we supported the development of regulatory science the funding of these kinds of experimental products and keeping the specialty societies involved at the fundamental level together with our regulatory agencies. And then finally, if you're really interested in it, there are frequently public-private partnerships, and MedEpiNet is one of those examples for people to get involved with, where industry, regulators, and academia come together with the sole purpose of providing safety for our patients. And we are stronger together. We have this on the device side, and I'll show you what we have on the drug side. Now, I don't deal with devices a lot, which is why I borrow slides from Fred Resnick, but I do deal on the drug side a lot. Ironically, that third picture that I showed you, Lou Cantalina, died in a plane crash in my state of Indiana a few years ago. Lou was the senior author of this seminal paper that many may not recognize. But this was the first reports of young women having Torsade when they were taking terfenadine. Terfenadine was the first non-sedating antihistamine. It was called Seldane at the time. Some may remember it, most don't. But terfenadine, in combination with metabolic inhibitors like erythromycin, would produce marked QT prolongation and Torsade in these otherwise healthy people. And it was this report that started us down the path of looking carefully at drugs that might have off-target effects on repolarization. If there's water close by, I might need a slug if there's, didn't plan on it. Now, for those online, many have never seen the original description of Torsade de Pointe. I apologize for the slide. This isn't in Medline or PubMed, but this is the original paper from Desartain and colleagues in Paris on Torsade. So you can say you've seen it now, but I have a follow-up lesson to this. And these were the original recordings. The lines on there are the drawings of the authors showing the twisting of the points arrhythmias that were attributed to the long QT and in this particular patient. But I'm going to take a little bit of a sojourn here for something that my mentors have always taught me, and that is when you think you've made a new observation, and this is 1971, somebody's made it before you. So be humble when you make a new observation, because here is another obscure paper on transient ventricular fibrillation from 1931. Again, a very poor copy of a journal, but showing a patient who was in complete heart block, poisoned on quinidine with Torsade, 40 years before Torsade was described. But Torsade's hot now, and Torsade has also been the subject of regulatory science. Another paper that that academicians generally don't, oh, thank you very much. So much. That doesn't really get into our academic literature very often, but this is if you are interested in QT prolongation and drug safety, you need to read this paper. This is the FDA guidance on how one evaluates a drug for the tendency to prolong QT and produce Torsade. This is not just the FDA's paper, but now this is internationally harmonized so that every regulatory agency around the world uses this document called the E14 and goes into the science of how one looks at this. And I'll get a little bit into this later on when we talk about my last topic, which is hydroxychloroquine, an interesting case study. And QT prolongation has provided us with the framework for the kinds of regulatory science that are necessary for taking this forward. I'm not going to have time to touch on it, but I will submit to you and for anyone who is interested in cardio-oncology, a new field that is going through growing pains with trying to understand the toxicities and the combined toxicities of thousands of new therapies and combinations of therapies. This is a roadmap for how we can start to deal with the issues that we're going to see in cardio-oncology. Anthracycline-induced cardiotoxicity, checkpoint inhibitor, myocarditis, those are model systems, but we need a much more systematic approach to how we're going to deal with this. This is a challenge for the coming generations. And as a side kick to the MedEpiNet, here is where a lot of this work goes on. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in this area, to go to the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium. This is a public-private academic forum. This is usually held at the FDA. It's now about 12 years old and has done wonderful work. They are taking on, the CSRC is taking on the cardio-oncology issues head on, and I think is a great place for docking for those people who are interested in this field. But for the clinicians, we've got much more, fundamental stuff to deal with. This is at our institution, an 85-year-old woman. She's got a respiratory infection. She's brought in, she gets some moxifloxacin, and oh, by the way, what happens? Okay. So this shouldn't surprise anybody. Moxifloxacin, when approached scientifically, is one of the most reliable QT prolongers there is. You say, well, I never see it. I give lots of moxifloxacin, I never see it. That's because of the way you look for it. You look for it with a single electrocardiogram, measured with a pair of handheld calipers and corrected with the Bazette correction factor. I agree, you'll never see anything. But this moxifloxacin is so reliable in terms of its ability to prolong QT, it is actually used as a positive control in research studies to test new drugs for their ability to prolong the QT. And this is just simple PK/PD curve here, done precisely, triplicate ECGs, measured on computers, and not corrected with Bazette correction factor. And we know the basic science of this, so we can build on that. We know that we have repolarization that goes on. We know that repolarization is dependent on several potassium currents, but there's this thing called the human ether-agogo related gene that is particularly sensitive to drug effects. And we know that the majority of drugs that prolong QT affect this channel, but not all. There are other mechanisms that we've defined as well. Pentamidine, remember these channels are trafficking, they're in dynamic equilibrium at the cell surface receptor. Pentamidine affects the maturation. Arsenic trioxide, our oncology colleagues well know, doesn't prolong QT right away. It waits about a week or two until it affects channel trafficking. So they know their patients with a variety of leukemias treated with arsenic trioxide have to be monitored a week or so after therapy. And we also know that QT prolongation is a surrogate for torsade, but torsade can occur at any QT. It doesn't have to occur at extreme QTs. So a great amount of science can be packed into these safety decisions. But as clinicians, we want to focus on populations at risk. We want to be able to make an impact on our patients, and we've done so. I don't know if these particular efforts have received wide application out in the clinic, but about a decade ago, the College and the Heart made a statement on preventing torsade in the hospital setting to provide a roadmap for hospitals to reduce risk for these patients. Two institutions, Mike Ackerman at Mayo and our institution, have put together risk score systems that are embedded in our electronic medical records. And our institution developed several years ago a clinical decision support system for reducing QT prolongation. And the proof of the pudding is that, oh, by the way, it works. Clinicians actually prescribe less QT prolonging drugs, and we see less QT prolongation when we use a clinical decision support system, which I don't have the details to go into. I don't have the time to go into the details, but I will tell you that it's not obtrusive. It's not one of these things that bugs you, but it's one of these things that will help you make the right decision for options for your patients. So at any level that you want to operate, especially as a researcher, a basic scientist, a clinical scientist, a clinical epidemiologist, a health systems service scientist, all have docking stations within regulatory science. So sometimes this comes out more into the public domain. And I'll use the case study of hydroxychloroquine because, you know, moxifloxacin's in the past and some of this stuff is in the past, but I think we had a great example of how not to do things with the safety issues with hydroxychloroquine. But for the fellows who are looking for something that might be testable on your boards, I would ask you, you know, what are the 3 cardiotoxicities of hydroxychloroquine? Can you name them? And regulators are not stupid. For those of you, this is a drug label. This is the original drug label for hydroxychloroquine. Okay, when it was first approved. And nobody reads drug labels, right? Because there's nothing in there that's of any utility. But let's take a look at what the FDA said about hydroxychloroquine when it was still marketed as Plaquenil. Oh, by the way, it produces cardiomyopathy. Oh, by the way, it can produce conduction system disorders. And oh, by the way, it prolongs the QT interval. So it's not just the QT hit on your heart, it's a triple hit on your heart. And we've known this forever. So for the fellows who are, this is actually, I think this is testable, and I think it's appearing on some boards, especially with the kind of cardiomyopathy. And for the fellows, the kind of cardiomyopathy has a certain resemblance to Fabry's disease. It's an infiltrative depositional cardiomyopathy, thickening of the heart muscle, with failure of the muscle eventually. And the EP fellows, the conduction system disorders, the development of bundle branch blocks and AV block and need for pacemakers is fairly famous with hydroxychloroquine. And the QT got the biggest hoo-ha when it came out, when we were going to use it for COVID. We fell a little bit behind the 8 ball on hydroxychloroquine, though, because hydroxychloroquine is one of these legacy drugs where the approval actually predates the harmonized approach to assessing QT interval. So when hydroxychloroquine was released full on into the public for the treatment of COVID, we all know that there were lots of papers published. Peer-reviewed papers that were published, and several of them supported the safe use of hydroxychloroquine, saying that there was not a signal there. But when you really take a look at these, and I'm not going to go through these point by point, but there was a consistent pattern of QT prolongation on torsade. It was consistent across all of the papers. Patients were excluded, drug regimens were altered, measurements were lousy, but there was still a consistent pattern. And it would have been a lot easier to figure out if it would have been done right. So those trials that were looking at drug safety, admittedly in a fluid and heated environment, were largely retrospective searches, looking at signal electrocardiograms. Nobody validated the measurements. They used the wrong correction factor. Bezet, by the way, overcorrects at high heart rates, undercorrects at slow heart rates, and corrects only perfectly at a heart rate of 60, which is the heart rate where you don't need a correction factor. And the events were not adjudicated. So this was sloppy science. I'm sorry. And I've told the authors this was just sloppy science, because the curve that I showed you with like MACC, these are triplet ECGs. These are read, these are centrally overread. They're overread in a digital environment. We use placebo and active controls in clinical trials to look at QTs, and we never use the Bezet correction. It's the one correction factor the FDA will reject. They will laugh you out of the room if you use it. So there was a big difference, but there was a lot of misinformation that came out. But at the end of the day, it was revoked. But that's not my point. My point is actually there's a silver lining to this, and that is that now, because of this, because of the uproar about use of hydroxychloroquine and the issues of drug safety, the rheumatologists have started to say, hey, should we be looking for stuff? Should we be seeing more? Should we be more active surveillance? And in the fall, just about a year ago now, I was the senior author. We published a collaborative white paper on helping the rheumatologist identify patients in front of them in the clinic that may have issues with hydroxychloroquine toxicity. Whether it's heart failure, whether it's conduction system disease, or whether it's a vulnerability to torsade de pointe because of QT prolongation. Now, getting a rheumatologist to get an ECG, I've discovered, is a challenge. So this is an ongoing saga. But I was happy to see that just a couple of weeks ago, this has started to pick up steam in terms of hydroxychloroquine being sort of a model system for, hey, let's relook at some of the safety profiles of some of these agents. This is a very large retrospective largely claims-based study of hydroxychloroquine versus methotrexate that was published in JACC online, and I think it's just going to be making the print journals. But I wanted to show you a couple things. Here are the forest plots from the central illustration, and it's showing us again this consistent message regarding drug safety. The left-hand forest plots are patients who have a history of heart failure. The right-hand patients are patients who don't have a history of heart failure. Hydroxychloroquine versus methotrexate. Now, admittedly, they're given in a little bit different rheumatologic populations, but you see a signal, again, retrospective data. You see a signal here for major adverse cardiac events coming out when we start to look at these patients. In the theme of regulatory science, the next step in this is going to be, what are those highest risk features? Heart failure is sort of a big bucket. What are the high risk features? What can we do to start to mitigate the risk in these patients? And where can we give this drug completely safely and not have to pay attention to long-term safety monitoring? So I hope I've convinced you that the model systems, and we've seen two now with the SGLT2 inhibitors and now with methotrexate, and I'm sure that if we really think about this, there are dozens more model systems where we can help our patients better by identifying safety signals and leveraging those, understanding the basic science behind those safety signals, and mitigating the risk so that the patients can get the options that they need. One way that the rheumatologist asked us is, we want a list. Give us a list of stuff that, if we have a patient who has a long QT on hydroxychloroquine, give us a list of stuff that we shouldn't give them as well. And they demanded the list, so we gave them sort of a list. I vigorously oppose this because this is not the way to do this, okay? Here's what I wanted to do, and here's what should have been done. Because this list is dynamic, the printed list is static, print it once, but the listing of QT prolonging drugs is dynamic. So I point all of my teams that care for patients who are concerned about QT prolongation, I point them to this app. It's called Credible Meds, and I wish that it wouldn't have gotten that name, but this is actually a very good scientific effort funded by ARC in the past and run out of the University of Arizona, out of their Center for Experimental Research Therapeutics. And Ray Woosley, who I've mentioned before, is the sort of the grandfather of Credible Meds. This is an app that keeps up to the minute the drugs that can be a risk for your patient. And it's obviously not just one drug. People who are taking hydroxychloroquine or taking any QT, or that they're taking Sotalol, they're taking other drugs. So you need a authoritative, up to the minute, dynamic source of information. So I encourage, if there are residents or fellows on this, this app is free. Download this app. This is your best source of information for QT prolonging drugs and the risks. And in fact, this is now dynamically referenced in papers that say, well, you need to assess other drugs for QT prolonging, and you can simply go to this app and find them. And oh, by the way, here's a little clinical pearl for you. My patients who I take care of who have, for example, congenital long QT syndrome, they do it themselves. They go to the drugstore and they get a Z-Pak, and they're looking it up themselves because they're not relying on the prescribing physician. They're not relying on the pharmacist who's overworked. They are simply looking at it themselves. And the purpose of this is not to be restrictive, but similar to our clinical decision support system that we have running at IU, it's simply to offer options. It isn't to be prohibitive and say, don't give Haldol in the ICU to this agitated patient with a QT of 500. But consider, is there an option? Are there safer options that you can use to keep your patient safe? So not the paternalistic viewpoint, but just simply to offer them options and involving the patients as well. So, sort of a whirlwind tour of drug and device safety, hopefully fit in with all your busy schedule this morning. But if you take home a few points of this, number one is this is our lane. To say this is something the FDA should take care of all of this, or the drug or the device manufacturer should take care of all of this, I think is an incorrect assumption. This is our job as frontline clinicians, because we are going to recognize these signals, and we should speak out when we think we identify a signal. But I also think that decisions around safety, rather than be made on emotion and conjecture, should be based on sound science. And there is a science behind this. I hope I've just at least introduced you to this. And then finally, maybe there's one person in the audience who says, hey, this is something that I think really would make me interested in doing this. And I think there are numerous opportunities, especially in those things like the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium and MedEpiNet, that are very, very welcoming organizations, organizations that want people to become involved and learn the power of these kinds of partnerships when everybody has the same goal in mind, and that's taking care of the patient in front of us. So I'll stop there, answer questions, and thank you all for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dick. That was really, really engaging and interesting. So I'll open up for questions here, and I'll see if stuff's coming up on the chat virtually. Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, thanks so much. Pretty interesting. So I'll start with our own plug-in. So the University of Georgia actually has a regulatory sciences program in their School of Pharmacy, and through your own Georgia CTSA, there's a certificate program available as well as an annual conference. And if you're really into it, there's actually a master's degree. So any of our fellows who are interested, at least for the annual conference. So I have a question for you though. So I get the value of something of the FDA and interactions with NCDR, but you also implied that it could also just sort of be the regular electronic medical record, Epic or something. Do you think that puts, given the fidelity of the electronic medical record, do you think that increases our risk of sort of false alerts by, sort of just pulling stuff out of Epic because, who knows who entered what?
Yep. So agree. So the issue is how good are our EHRs, and we all know they're not great. I think that those systems need adjudication. They do need adjudication. I didn't get into it in great detail. There is some non-disclosure, but I can say publicly that Beacom Boskert, so Beacom from Baylor, who's heart failure and editor of Jack Heart Failure, and I have been sort of drafted to watch the phase 4 commitment from Moderna on post-vaccine myocarditis. This is going to be done through EHRs, but with expert adjudication of events. So I think that the EHR has value in such a large volume of data, but the clinical context still requires the expert adjudication. So I think it requires a combination. And then you say, then the closing loop is that if you close the loop and have actions within the EHR, if those recommended actions in terms of the safety of the patient are not reliable, then all of the regulatory science blows up. So they have to be trustworthy recommendations if we're going to embed the recommendations in the EHR. So maybe the short answer is trust but verify.
So I'm curious. You talked a lot about the sort of role of clinicians in reporting events. The sort of flip side of this in terms of trying to get some teeth and enforcement of actual conduct of post-marketing studies, as required, particularly when you look at a lot of the alternative pathways that are being used now. What are your thoughts on sort of opportunities for enforcement of those kinds of requirements?
Well, for the health policy wonk, so the FDAA, the Food and Drug Administration Renewal Act, put teeth in, gave the right for the FDA to actually do stuff when phase 4 commitments were not met. And this is a very insightful question, and I didn't mention, phase 4 is post-market. Many phase 4 commitments are made around safety, and 90% plus of phase 4 commitments are not kept. Sometimes it has consequences. So mitidrine, mitidrine's a good drug, right? Okay. In 2010, mitidrine was removed from the market because it failed to prove that it was either safe or efficacious, and the manufacturer failed in their phase 4 commitments to do that. Now there was a big kerfuffle and outcry, and it's back on the market. But if you ask me whether mitidrine is either safe or effective for its intended use, I don't know. So there need to be more teeth. They need to keep their commitments. Congress needs to, or they need to enforce the law that they have in place. We need to do this. We need to have the fortitude to back this up.
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to know your thoughts about, as I think about safety of drugs, I think about sex differences, and then I think about elderly, the very elder, greater than 85.
Yep.
And so like the Ambien story where, there's specific indication for doses.
Mhm.
What would it take? I mean, I wanted your thoughts because, to go through every drug that we use now and look in Hippocrates and look for men, those, female, elderly, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, great question. And there's lots of little side talks that I give off this. I gave you this is the sort of the data dump, but I've told my colleagues that, QT prolongation, Torsade is being a woman, female sex is a risk factor. Torsade is a women's health issue. Never makes the top 10 list of stuff for cardiology, but it is. So how do we deal with this? Well, I think this is where the power of our information systems can come to bear. Do we have to go through drug by drug? But we've well defined, as I said, Torsade provides a model. And if you look at our risk model for Torsade, it's really held up. Jim Tisdale is my collaborator on this. It's called the Tisdale model, the Tisdale risk score, and it includes female sex, age, heart failure, use of loop diuretic. This stuff all comes out in the wash when you look at small samples or large samples. So I do think we need to look, and we need to look at the effects in the elderly. How we do that is challenging. I would also say, there's often limited data at the other end of the spectrum. Children and adolescents, we have less data because of the difficulties with doing clinical trials in those populations. So I don't have a solution for you, but hopefully there's somebody online that's going to take this up as a career challenge and really who's smart with data systems, perhaps with artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, and be able to sort this out without having to do a lot of manual labor.
Thanks so much for making us aware of all this. I will say it's scary out there when you think of all the Zithromax and Z-Packs that are passed out in the family practitioners' offices and the pediatricians' offices. I always, every time that happened to one of my grandchildren, I always start saying, oh, I hope there's not any kind of QT issue behind all this. Number one. And number two, they go out just after that and buy over-the-counter something that prolongs QT, and that's a setup for trouble, but it goes on all the time. And then from years ago at Grady and here and all of our hospitals, we are constantly battling hypokalemia because most of our patients in the hospital were giving IV furosemide or torsemide. And that, of course, that was on your list, but that, of course, causes hypomagnesemia and hypokalemia, which prolongs a QT. And I'm always asking the house officers, how do you diagnose hypokalemia on the EKG? And you lose magnitude, a la Charles Fish. You lose magnitude of T wave and you gain magnitude of the U wave. And watching for those kind of things in the unit where Neil is all the time, especially in the setting of giving drugs like IV Levaquin, it's just simply a setup. You add a little heart disease to that, and that situation has a Torsade written all over it. And that, of course, out of the old days when we used to use quinidine, that was also a setup, as you showed, prolonging the QT, and that was called a quinidine toxicity, and we know a lot more about it now. But anyway, thanks so much.
Well, I'll pile on to the quinidine story. So I will tell you that we had a patient at the University Hospital, we have a very active liver transplant service, and the patient contracted babesiosis. And the infectious disease doctors were going over the case, and the patient was vomiting incessantly. and couldn't take anything oral. So they found that this stuff called quinidine could be given IV and could be an antiparasite medication for this patient, and gave gram quantities of quinidine IV off a monitor. And guess what happened? We published the case. Unfortunately, you know what happened. So we continue to reinvent these wheels. But your point about the Z-Pak, but there are passionate people who argue, and we got into this with hydroxychloroquine, is Torsade doesn't exist because I don't see it. I've not seen it. Now, we know through safety databases that filling a prescription for azithromycin versus filling a prescription for amoxicillin for the same disease imparts a 5-fold risk of death. These are small numbers of deaths, but the magnitude of the increase is there. That's been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But convincing the individual when these events are rare is very problematic. It's very problematic. The rheumatologist, certainly, that was a lot of arm twisting to get them to say hydroxychloroquine in certain patients might be a problem, and I might need to get an electrocardiogram. Because as I said in the prepared talk, that asking a rheumatologist to get an ECG, I thought I was asking them to get a root canal. They said, this is a big problem. How are we going to get it? We have to go somewhere else. And then I get the number back. I don't know what to do with the number. And I don't know, I got to call a cardiologist. So implementation is a real issue. Was there a question online?
Yeah, I've just got a question about the devices. You were talking about when things are rare, and I'm thinking back to 2 device issues where when initially we report these and they come back and they say, well, this was probably operator related. One was an ICD lead that perforated through the heart after a number of months. The company came to us and said, oh, our device doesn't perforate any more than anybody else's. But there was a difference between micro perforations and perforations where you'd see the lead, way out in the lung. And the other was with an LVAD where the drive line, where the outflow graft would kink. And in those situations, they come and say, well, it's probably something that you're doing. And it's not until a number of centers start sort of communicating with each other that it gets raised to a higher level. So my question is, for those types of things, how do you get the attention and how do you report them? Is the form that you talked about, is that adequate, or just your thoughts around that?
So in my case report, I had with the Hawk 1 device, I said, tell the field rep. That's in Indiana, that's the fox guarding the hen house kind of thing. So you're exactly right that in our interactions with industry, and we love our industry partners, but they don't want their device to lose market share or be off the market. So they're going to be incredibly conservative about trying to explain away observations. They should be part of the process. They need to be part of the process, but they shouldn't be the fulcrum. So how do you, when you identify something and feel there is a problem, how do you magnify that? Well, I think that number one is using MedWatch. We way under report stuff. And so that rare thing that says, oh yeah, well, this was operator error. We still need to report. We need probably to report a lot more. We're probably at a 5% reporting of where we should be. I think also there are combined databases at the FDA that can be leveraged for this. We can look in our national registries that we own, like the NCDR. We can develop academic consortium, and also we can communicate our concerns directly to the FDA. Commissioner's a cardiologist. So I got his phone number, but so we shouldn't be shy about that. If we feel like this is, we realize that the companies will come down with, with defensive postures. Maybe they're appropriate defensive postures. Maybe it was an operator error, but I think we need to report a lot. We need to report a lot more. We need to make it part of our culture.
The talk was great. And on that same line, back in 2009, I noticed IVC filter fracture that went through the right heart and went into the lungs. Talked to the FDA about this, reported to the MACC database, but ended up going back and doing a retrospective study and showed that it was about a 20+% fracture rate, and wrote the Sentinel paper on IVC filter fractures. Bard came in, seized my computers, paid about $25,000, $30,000. It was funny, like now to think about it, but you're a community physician at the time. You have no protection. You have this monster multi-billion-dollar company that can come in and just destroy you. What's the I went to Bram Zuckerman at the FDA. Finally, Rita Redberg helped me out with getting me put in touch with some legal defense. But where is the protective quality for somebody that's trying to do the right thing, that is very, very vulnerable and went through all these routes? And I think was very disappointed with the degree of protection by any of the societies or anybody else. So where is the protection out there for the little guy out there that's very, very vulnerable? I mean, it's intimidating when they roll in and they've got unlimited money. They're going after your personal stuff. I mean, they seized my home computer, my laptops. I paid a ton of money for something that's now been proven to purely be absolutely right, but but you're doing the right things, but you're definitely exposing yourself. And I don't know if the societies step up to protect you.
Well, I don't have I didn't know that story was in this room, but I know that story, and I know stories like this where large company, Telectronics that I showed doesn't exist anymore, other than the Telectronics Foundation that exists to pay the widows and orphans. But I think that the single person is vulnerable. I think that the specialty societies probably have skin in this game and provide added bulk, and the forums like MedEpiNet, like the Cardiac Safety Research Consortium, where these concerns can be aired in a public-private regulatory environment where everybody gets the same information, but you're absolutely correct, and I don't have a pat answer for defense of the single voice, other than to take on the cloak of your specialty society and amplify your voice through these existing conglomerations of people, consortiums that come together to try to provide safety. Doesn't pay your legal bills, though.
No, I mean, the only reason why I bring it up is you have a high influential power in the societies, and I think it's a gap that maybe somebody needs to bring attention to at some point, to say, where does somebody go? Because it's hard. I mean, you go to the FDA, exactly like you said, and spend a year dealing with them, but I mean, there's a certain time kind of motivation behind it, because these are dangerous, fractures and complications. Nobody's pulling it off the market. They're not stopping what they're doing. So you feel kind of pressed to push things forward. So, but it's a gap that maybe there needs to be an avenue for the voice out there to be able to get some bigger support, so that they're not standing alone.
Excellent point.
All right, well, we'll call it there. It's great Q&A. Thanks again, Dick, for coming, and everyone have a great day today.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.